Chapter 5, The Young Republic. Part 2, Jefferson and the Republicans. Section 1. Jefferson begins the reign of the Republicans. With Jefferson's election to the presidency in late 1800, there would be a dramatic shift in the character of the new republic. The Federalists were out, the Republicans were in. The Federalist emphasis under Washington, inspired by his close advisor Hamilton, had been to serve primarily the urban commercial interests of the coastal East. The Republican emphasis under Jefferson and the fellow Virginians who followed him to the presidency would be the rural South and West. Reshaping the Republic's finances. Hamilton had used a growing, but responsible, national debt as a means of locking the financial leaders of the new country into full support of the new republic. However, inspired by the American farmer's instinctive dislike of the banking world, Jefferson moved immediately to undercut Hamilton's strategy by reducing the size of the debt. He had his new Treasury Secretary, Albert Gallatin, abolish the domestic taxation, such as the hated excise tax on the farmer's whiskey, and instead raise revenue through the customs duties and the sale of land in the Western territories. The former measure would put much of the new tax burden on the commercial Northeast. The latter measure, through actually rather inexpensive land sales, would bring about greater American settlement in the Western territories, putting further burden on the Indian tribes living there. Jefferson's intention was very clearly to strengthen the political voice in the new republic of the rural South and West, at the cost of the heavily urban Federalist Northeast. Also in line with his Republican dislike of a strong central authority, preferring states' rights instead, and as part of his strategy to reduce the republic's debts, Jefferson moved to reduce the government budget by half, and thus also to reduce the federal bureaucracy by nearly the same amount. A particular target was the collectors of the excise tax. Also, as the bureaucracy had been previously staffed almost entirely through Federalist appointments, Jefferson's Republicans were placed in half the remaining positions. The war with the Barbary pirates at the shores of Tripoli. Jefferson was also adamantly opposed to maintaining, at the public expense, a huge standing army. Using the logic that the Indian tribes to the west had been pacified, Jefferson was eventually able to cut the size of the army in half. Footnote. However, he did perform one great service to the military by establishing a military academy at West Point, the goal being to bring young Republicans into military command. End of footnote. He also had a similar goal with respect to the Navy, wanting to replace the Navy's 6 new fighting ships, or frigates, with smaller coastal vessels, used primarily to catch northeastern shippers trying to avoid Jefferson's new customs duties. However, before he got going on his naval reduction program, he found himself facing a huge problem that had long infuriated the Americans: the Barbary pirates of the North African Mediterranean coast. Operating as privateers out of the Muslim states of Tripoli, Tunisia, Algiers, and Morocco, these pirates had long raided Christian shipping, seizing not just the ships and their cargo, but also the sailors who manned them, holding them for ransom or even selling them into slavery. America paid a huge ransom each year to bring release for its captured sailors, approximately $1 million annually, roughly 10% of the government's total budget. Jefferson had long protested the decision of Washington Adams to pay this ransom, and now as president was determined that this policy was going to come to an end. When the Bashaw of Tripoli declared war on the United States in 1801, Jefferson responded by sending Commodore Preble, who linked up with the King of Naples, that is in Italy, to attack Tripoli's pirates. Then Preble set up a blockade against the Barbary states with an increase in the American naval presence in the Mediterranean. But in late 1803, one of his frigates, the Philadelphia, ran aground in the Tripoli harbor. However, rather than let the ship fall into the hands of the pirates, in early 1804, Americans boldly slipped into the harbor and set the ship ablaze. Then, in 1805, the American consul in Tunis gathered a band of mercenaries and crossed the Libyan desert to seize the coastal town of Derna, just as also the American fleet arrived to bombard the town from the sea. The Barbary pirates were ready to sue for peace, and thus the Americans proved themselves quite ably on the high seas. But growing problems with England and France as the Napoleonic Wars heated back up again would pull the Navy from the region in 1807. It would not be until after those wars were brought to an end in 1815 that a final victory over the Barbary states would be accomplished. The Louisiana Purchase, 1803. At the same time that he was reducing the influence in the Republic of the Urban and Federalist Northeast, Jefferson busied himself looking to the territory across to the west of the Appalachian Mountains. The new American Northwest beckoned thousands of agrarian and thus Republican settlers. As nature would have things, however, to bring their produce to market, these settlers would have to look to the rivers which flowed west and south away from the mountains and towards the mighty Mississippi River, which, however, flowed through French territory as it approached at New Orleans, the Gulf of Mexico, and thus the high seas. So it was that Jefferson asked his ambassador to France, Robert Livingston, who was later joined by a future president, James Monroe, to negotiate with Napoleon the purchase of this French town. But America was in for a surprise when Napoleon offered not just New Orleans, but the entire French territory, that is, Louisiana, to the west of the Mississippi River to America for a mere $15 million. The Louisiana Territory, which reached westward all the way to the Rocky Mountains, had been originally French, but was turned over to the Spanish in 1763 as price of France's losing the French and Indian War, that is, Europe's 7 Years' War. But in 1800, the French Emperor Napoleon forced Spain to give it back to France in anticipation of renewing the French Empire in America. But failure in 1802 to suppress a Creole, that is, African independence uprising in the sugar-rich Caribbean island of Santo Domingue, or Haiti, and a renewal of hostilities with England had left Napoleon desperately in need of cash. This is what moved Napoleon, therefore, to sell off the whole Louisiana Territory to the new United States. In any case, Napoleon saw no immediate economic advantage in possessing this vast continental wilderness, and $15 million seemed much more useful to his European ambitions. And, thanks to Hamilton's putting the young American Republic on strong financial footing, America was well able to afford the European recognized rights to this very valuable Western territory. Footnote: the Indians, of course, would offer no such recognition, but that legal matter counted for little in the American thinking of the times. End of footnote. In effect, this nearly doubled the size of the new American nation, and it ended, for a while anyway, French ambitions in America, and put America on a new international footing. As Robert Livingston himself put it, "We have lived long, but this is the noblest work of our whole lives. The United States take rank this day among the first powers of the world." The Lewis and Clark Expedition, 1804-1806. Jefferson was quick to send Army Captain Meriwether Lewis, accompanied by William Clark, and a team of 50 men to explore the new territory. Footnote: Jefferson would also send out other teams to explore the new territory, including that of General Zebulon Pike, who in 1806 ventured as far west as the territory that would become Colorado. It was also captured by the Spanish in the process, but released in 1807. Leaving St. Louis in May of 1804, Lewis and Clark headed west up the Missouri River hoping to find finally a water route to connect with the Pacific Ocean, reaching today's North Dakota as winter set in. Here they hired a French trapper and his Indian wife, Sacagawea, to guide them further west. The next summer they reached the headwaters of the Missouri River in the high Rocky Mountains, disappointed in not finding the water route they'd hoped for. Then they pushed westward beyond the Rockies, and thus the boundaries of the Louisiana Territory, until, after an incredibly difficult time, they reached the Pacific Ocean in November. There they wintered, turning back eastward early in 1806 and arriving in St. Louis in September, welcomed with great enthusiasm as heroes. Federal land development. In looking west, Jefferson saw the need to connect that part of America with the home base east of the Appalachian Mountains. Western land sales were booming, and the U.S. Treasury thus was well endowed to finance public roads and canals. A Republican Congress in 1806 authorized Jefferson to construct a national road reaching into the Ohio Territory. But this was just the beginning. Treasury Secretary Gallatin began work on a proposal for massive development of America's agricultural hinterland to help the farmer get his goods to market by road or by canal. In 1808, he proposed a multi-million-dollar, $6 to $20 million, plan to build a canal to connect the Atlantic with the Great Lakes and to construct additional national roads, some of the plan financed directly by the government, some of it through private contractors financed by loans from the government. Footnote. In the end, most of this project was financed by private interests of the states rather than by the federal government. End of footnote. Thus it was that the small government mentality of the Republicans was easily reversed when it came to the role of the government in supporting the American farmer. Hamilton versus Burr, 1804. Aaron Burr was an ambitious American who would be king. He headed up the New York wing of Jefferson's Republican Party and was selected to run with Jefferson in 1800 to balance the ticket, that is, the Virginia South and the New York North. But at the time, the vote was not set up in any way that could distinguish a presidential vote from the vice presidential vote, and Burr thus had the same number of votes as Jefferson. Footnote 17. This error would be corrected by the 12th Amendment to the Constitution, fully ratified by the states in 1804. Hamilton took this opportunity to harass his old political opponent, Jefferson, by urging the Federalists to tie up the vote when it went to the House of Representatives, that is, to break the tie between the two candidates. Yet, in the end, Hamilton disliked even more intensely Burr and finally threw his support to Jefferson, not gaining any appreciation from Jefferson, however, but gaining a deep hatred from Burr. The rivalry finally reached crisis proportion 4 years later in the heat of a New York governorship election in which Burr was a candidate. He had been dropped by Jefferson as his running mate in Jefferson's re-election bid that year. Deeply derogatory anti-Burr letters that Hamilton had written, intended for private usage only, ended up being submitted for publication, no one is quite certain by whom, producing the sense of deep insult that back then demanded remedy in the usual way, a pistol duel. This is quite illegal, but widely practiced at the time. Most of these duels ended up with both parties purposely shooting wild, not hurting anyone, but satisfying the code of honor. Hamilton had participated in 10 of these prior to his meeting with Burr on July the 11th, 1804, though his son Philip had been killed a few years earlier in a duel when the shotless strategy went awry. Anyway, Hamilton shot first, a bit wide of the mark, accidentally or purposely. Burr returned the shot, mortally wounding Hamilton, who died the next day from the wound. Burr was subsequently indicted for murder, although the charges were soon dropped. but sensing that he had just killed his own political career as well as his enemy Hamilton, Burr retreated to South Carolina. Then he returned to Washington, D.C. to finish out his term as vice president before heading west to the recently acquired Louisiana Territory to start a new life. What, of political intrigue? He had plans of a strange sort, which were later reported by an even bigger schemer, Wilkinson, as involving the creation of an empire with Burr as its head, never really proved nor disproved. Burr then moved to Europe, finally returning in 1812 to his law practice in New York, spending the rest of his life quietly out of politics. The development of the powers of the U.S. Supreme Court. One part of the Federalist heritage that the Republicans could not undo was the Supreme Court and its various Federalist appointees by Adams, most notably the U.S. Supreme Court Chief Justice John Marshall. Marshall was a strong Federalist, unlike most of the rest of his fellow Virginians, who tended to be Jeffersonian Republicans. He had declined Washington's offers of being part of his administration, turning down the offer first to be the nation's Attorney General and then ambassador to France, and even Adams' first attempt to nominate him to the Supreme Court. But considered one of the most brilliant lawyers of his days, he was again nominated to the Supreme Court as its Chief Justice in Adams' frantic effort to put Federalists in office before the Republicans took control of both Congress and the White House in early 1801. This time Marshall accepted the offer. Jefferson and the Republicans were furious about the Federalist judiciary, especially by the way the Federalist-dominated courts had treated Republicans under the ill-fated Alien and Sedition Acts, and were determined to clean the courts of the midnight judges. When Jefferson's Secretary of State Madison refused to sign the commission of the Federalist William Marbury, appointing him Justice of the Peace in Washington, D.C., Marbury sued Madison, bringing before Marshall's Supreme Court the famous case of Marbury versus Madison, 1803, which Marbury subsequently lost. This seemed, at the time, to be a victory for the Republicans, in the sense that Marshall stated that the court could not force Madison to accept Marbury's appointment. But in actuality, the decision marked a subtle but strong Federalist victory. Marshall's explanation for not deciding with Marbury was because the law providing for Marbury's and others' appointment, the Judiciary Act of 1789, was unconstitutional. Thus, Marshall accorded to the Supreme Court the power to decide what laws of Congress were and were not constitutional. Though the Constitution itself mentioned no such power, Marshall's decision was not contested, and thus the principle empowering the Supreme Court as the final arbiter of what was and was not constitutional took, by default, a permanent place in American constitutional law. For the next 3 decades, Marshall and the Supreme Court rendered various decisions which further strengthened not only the voice of the Supreme Court, but also the supremacy of the Washington, D.C. government over the various state governments. For instance, in the Fletcher versus Peck 1810 decision, Marshall's Supreme Court affirmed that federal authority took precedence over the laws of the individual states. In McCulloch versus Maryland 1819, his courts denied the right of the states to tax federal agencies, in this case the Bank of the United States. In Cohens versus Virginia 1821, Marshall declared that the Supreme Court had review powers over the decisions of the state courts. Section 2. An agrarian America is introduced to the Industrial Revolution. Beyond mere self-support, the American economy since its founding as a group of English colonies was designed from the point of view of the English mother country, largely with one purpose in mind: to supply England with raw materials needed to feed its growing industrial society. New England, however, tended to pursue a largely self-support economic agenda, with its Puritan ideal of Christian self-sufficiency. However, the American South, from its founding, had been deeply supportive of the mother country's hunger for raw materials, tobaccos, dyes, and, at first, small amounts of cotton. Footnote. In comparison to the Caribbean islands, which supplied to England the commodities of sugar and rum, highly sought after at the time, the English colonies of continental America were considered to be interesting, but of much lesser value as economic assets. End of footnote. But by the end of the 1700s, all of that was about to change. The beginnings of America's Industrial Revolution. Samuel Slater. Slater was an Englishman who had apprenticed as a youth to Richard Arkwright, the inventor of the water-driven machinery which spun raw cotton into the thread needed for England's growing textile industry. Slater slipped off to America in 1789 with the knowledge of this process in his head. Such technology was considered such a strategic secret that what Slater was doing was highly illegal in England. To set up a spinning mill of his own in Rhode Island in 1790. So successful was his mill that Slater soon expanded his operations to Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New Hampshire. Eli Whitney. Slater's contribution to the American economy coincided with the contribution that Whitney made when, as a youth, he moved from Massachusetts to Georgia to study law. Observing the painfully slow process by which slaves extracted seeds from cotton balls in order to ready the cotton as raw material for yarn production, in 1793 Whitney came up with a machine that could perform that same process mechanically, greatly speeding up the process and the profitability of Southern cotton production, destined for the English textile mills, and soon also the rapidly growing number of Yankee textile mills in New England. Indeed, this simple invention revolutionized the South, confirming the South as an agrarian society focused on the growing and exporting of raw cotton, but also confirming slavery as a Southern institution, as thousands of slaves would be needed to plant and pick the cotton, now so vital to the Southern economy, and also to the small Southern aristocracy, whose wealth soon became founded almost entirely on this single industry. Growing sectionalism. Yankee culture. What was taking place was the widening of the gap that separated the northern Yankee culture from the southern slave-based aristocratic culture. Yankee culture extolled hard work and inventiveness and produced not only a never-widening variety of industrial products, but also a rapid growth in inventions that would quickly bring America into the Industrial Revolution that had been shaking Europe. In fact, very soon, Yankee America would surpass Europe itself in the vastness of its industrial creativity and energy. It was heady stuff, stimulating a culture that became increasingly fascinated with its own human ability or powers to shape the world according to its own design. It did not at first see itself as leaving behind the deeply devout Christian culture that originally formed New England. It was simply moving ahead or progressing, supposedly to the pleasure of the Creator God, in bringing the wonders of a perfect heaven to an ever-perfecting earth. Southern culture. The South, on the other hand, seemed to be moving in the direction of Jefferson's idealized agrarian utopia, where a leisure gentry would preside over a highly structured, even stratified agricultural society. Supposedly, this presented a picture of agrarian bliss, with the slaves singing in the fields as they produced the harvests that brought the valuable revenues to the entire community, and the aristocracy conducting their rounds of intellectual discourse and genteel socializing as the confirming symbol of the success of it all. Of course, few people lived lives that measured up to this bliss, but it was a beautiful social picture, so compelling that it led even poor white farmers to believe that someday they would share this same bliss with their cousins, enjoying the refinements of plantation life. Jefferson versus Hamilton. In many ways, this was the cause of the bitterness that separated Jefferson and his Republicans from Hamilton and the Federalists. Hamilton came of questionable social circumstances and had worked his way forward in society through simply a lot of hard work and sheer determination. To Jefferson, born to social privilege, Hamilton's type of social climbing seemed vulgar, as it did to all English gentry, and inappropriate as a social model for the emerging American culture. Indeed, these two lifestyles, these two cultures, not only had little in common except the name American, they were in so many ways mutually antagonistic that there was no way that some kind of cultural, social, or even political battle was not inevitable. And Hamilton's death at the hands of the aristocratic Burr, who, though a New York Northerner, shared Jefferson's view on how America should take shape, was perhaps symbolic of the bitter struggle to come. Southern honor, after all, simply couldn't be allowed to suffer the indignities of upstart Yankee presumptuousness.